categorizations of systems. So I've got my autonomic nervous system, I've got a sensory nervous system. The autonomic nervous system divides between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. There are all these sections, all these categories of the nervous system are responsible for doing particular types of jobs. Right? One of the things that is interesting when you look at the nervous system is that we see quite a lot of fatigue when we're teaching motor skills, when we're training. It's possible to see fatigue within the nervous system, right? So that fatigue could be central, okay? So it could be something in the brain and the spinal column. That's not very clear. Although we know we see a decrease in force production because of a decrease in stimulus from the central nervous system. It's difficult to know still why. The research hasn't completely cleared up why. Or the fatigue could occur in the peripheral nervous system outside the spinal column, right? We also see a decrease in force production, but we have a better idea of the mechanisms that are leading to that decrease in force production when we look at the peripheral nervous system, right? We see drops in ATP. We know that we see a change in the pH that affects the impulse transmission. We see a change at the neuromuscular junction, so we see fatigue at the neuromuscular junction. And it's possible that the type of activity plays a role in where we see this fatigue occur. All right? So if we're doing concentric type activities, we tend to see fatigue in the peripheral system before we see the fatigue in the central system. If we're doing isometric type activities, then that's reversed. The fatigue appears to occur within the central nervous system, and then we see fatigue in the peripheral. So there's a lot to learn about fatigue in the nervous system, all right? But it typically leads to a decrease in force production. So as a coach or a teacher, that's important to understand because, you know, you can't assume that someone's just not trying as hard as they were 10 minutes ago or something like that. It could be a physiological fatigue issue rather than a psychological fatigue issue. Does that make sense? Right? You've got to be able to at least think about the idea that it may not be psychological, right? That there could be something going on physically. Right? So we were looking at this idea of a motor nerve synapsing with particular muscle cells, with particular muscle fibers. All the fibers that attach to a particular nerve are of the same type. So my motor nerve does not stimulate type 1s and type 2s. It stimulates either type 1s or type 2s, right? And when we look at the development of the nervous system, that occurs because actually the nerve dictates which muscle fiber develops. Right? So the nerve will be either a faster nerve, in which case the muscle fiber will develop into a type 2, or it will be a slightly slower version and it will stimulate the development of type 1. Alpha motor neurons have very short dendrites within the spinal column, And then that information comes down, remember the axon, once it leaves the spinal column, that axon is going all the way to whichever muscle fiber it's going to stimulate. So the axon could be short or long, depending how close the muscle is to the spinal column. So the other term you want to pay attention to is the idea of a motor unit. Right? So this is a motor nerve, or a neuron. A motor unit is the functional component, because the nerve doesn't do anything on its own and the fiber doesn't do anything on its own. Right? So the two have to communicate together. So the functional unit, a motor unit, is the motor nerve and all the fibers that attach to that nerve. So, an alpha motor neuron and all the fibers that are stimulated by that particular neuron, that whole thing is a motor unit. With me so far? Yes. Hoorah! I like Wednesdays. Everybody's kind of woken up from Monday and they haven't run out of steam yet like Friday. Wednesdays are good. All right. So, again, hopefully, that's okay. Good plan. Hopefully, action potential and the idea of an electrical impulse isn't brand new. Okay. Action potential is the technical term for the piece of electricity that's running along the nerve. It's the signal from the brain to the muscle. If we have a resting membrane potential, so at the point at which the nerve or the muscle tissue is not carrying electricity, right, not transporting that signal, then no impulse. Resting membrane potential. So anytime we use the word rest in ex-phys, we're looking at kind of status quo scenario. We always want to get back to the resting state in our systems once we've exercised or we've done some work. So, in order to get a potential, in order to get an action potential, I have to change the balance of the charge across the membrane. Okay? So, I've got to alter the positives and negatives on either side of the membrane in order to stimulate an action potential. How does that happen? We depolarize the nerve cell or the muscle cell. So when we depolarize a cell, we open the sodium channels and we allow sodium to flood into the cell. Sodium is a positive ion, and so it changes the balance of positives and negatives across the membrane. So if I took altmeter, can't remember, charge meter, just like you would put it into a socket or whatever to see whether the socket was live, is there electricity running in the socket, we could do the same thing, stick it into the muscle cell or into the nerve cell, and it would register an electrical charge. Okay. Don't get too hung up on small details. Right? We want to know enough about how we get the signal to the muscle. So I depolarize from rest. I depolarize. That allows the signal to move down the nerve. And then I have to repolarize to get back to rest. Okay. And when we repolarize, the way we do that is to open some other channels and we allow potassium to move as well, so we put the balance back across the membrane. There's a bit of a delay, a very, very short delay. Right? I open the sodium channel, I close the sodium channel, I open the potassium channel. Very brief, the whole cycle from rest to depolarize to repolarize back to rest only takes a few milliseconds. Right? So what I'm seeing is very, very rapid movement of sodium and potassium across the membrane. So one of the things that dictates the type 1 or type 2 is that a type 1 motor neuron has a smaller axon. Doesn't mean shorter. When we say smaller, we mean the diameter is smaller. So when I think about this idea, this occurs quite slowly because there's not so much, I can't move the ions backwards and forwards. There's not as much of them. A type 2 nerve has a larger diameter axon, so it can carry the action potential faster. So here's my ions and my channel. Right? At rest, the channels are closed. When it's stimulated, because the next piece of tissue over has the electrical stimulus, it opens the sodium channel and the sodium floods in. So it depolarizes the membrane. Then it closes and opens potassium and we repolarize. So if we graph it, it looks like this. Here's rest. Here's my action potential. Here's repolarizing, and I go back to rest. So resting membrane potential in a muscle is around minus 70 millivolts. When we depolarize the membrane, it can go up as high as 40. So from minus 70 to 40, that's a very big swing in charge in a very, very short amount of time. So we're talking a lot of ions moving. And then it drops down, it goes a little bit further than it needs to, and then it comes back to rest. It's big swings across a short period of time. Right? So, electrical, down the nerve. When the nerve gets to the neuromuscular junction, we've got a gap. I can't carry an electrical signal across a gap, right? Because the electrical signal has to have a membrane to change the plus and minus across the membrane. So across the gap, what are we going to change into at the neuromuscular junction? Which neurotransmitter carries the signal across the gap at the neuromuscular junction? That was last week. How do you get in?
So it's a G.
Let's not start with a G. Oh, bingo. All right, so we have an action potential traveling down the motor nerve. It's electrical. Gets to the neuromuscular junction. We have to convert it into a chemical charge to get across the junction. So we release acetylcholine when the vesicles are stimulated by the action potential. And we release a flood of acetylcholine across the gap, and the acetylcholine attaches to receptors on the other side of the gap, in our case onto the muscle cell. If enough acetylcholine attaches to the surface of the muscle, then it will stimulate the electrical charge to pick up and travel across the surface of the muscle.
What's the difference between the acetylcholine and the acetylCoA?
No, acetyl-CoA is your, that's the thing that goes into Krebs cycle.
Two completely different things,
Yes.
right?
This is a molecule that's broken down from carbs, fats, or proteins and can enter Krebs cycle. This is a chemical molecule that acts as a neurotransmitter at the junction. Okay? Oh, that was a good question. Good question. All right. So, enough acetyl-CoA attaches to the muscle membrane, stimulates the action potential, and we see the exact same thing across the surface of the muscle. Right? Opens the sodium channels, and then closes sodium channels and opens potassium channels. Right? So, given that sequence of how the signal moves through the system, then it becomes reasonable to understand why motor nerves are myelinated. Right? Not all nerves are myelinated. Motor nerves are. And one of the reasons we see young children getting more coordinated and getting better at skills is because myelination is still developing and it isn't complete until around the age of 4. So the signal to the muscles is a little bit slower in a 2-year-old than it is in a 4 or 5-year-old. So the myelin sheath around the muscle is a fatty substance, all right? So it is in lumps. Let me see if I've got a diagram. Oh, there's a diagram. So when I look at a nerve, right, I have the axon. The myelin sheath develops in little blocks. So I get this. Right? All the way down the axon. And so what happens here is the fatty substance insulates the nerve and allows the action potential to jump sections of the nerve. That means the action potential can move down the nerve a lot faster. All right, so instead of having to stimulate every piece of tissue to open and close ion channels, I can jump the signal from here to here, from here to here, from here to here, from here to here, and then I can get to the muscle faster. So myelination is just a mechanism that evolved to move that signal down the nerve faster to the muscle. It's not very good if I see a tiger, right, and my brain sends a signal to run, but the signal travels quite slowly down the nerves, and by the time my legs move to run, the tiger started eating me, right? So it's a lot easier and a lot safer for me if I see the tiger and that signal gets there really quick and I can run away. How fast the signal can travel through the nervous system dictates how quickly you can respond. So the gap is called the node of Ranvier. The little fatty blob is the myelin sheath. All nice and simple, right? Increases the velocity of neural conduction massively, all right? And it conserves energy. So a motor nerve can transmit a signal anywhere in in the region up to 150 times faster than a regular nerve. So pretty dramatic increase. And the diameter of the nerve also plays a role in the conduction. The larger the diameter, the faster I can shift the signal. Type 2 nerves have larger diameters than type 1 nerves. So we have a principle here that we need to get the hang of, and we have a size principle. Motor units are recruited from the smallest to the largest, typically. Right? So I'm going to go from a type 1, because type 1 nerves are smaller. They attach to less fibers. And then I'm going to start pulling in type 2s. So we typically, the size principle says, I'm going to use my type 1 fiber. Then I'm going to recruit type 2A fibers if I need to. Then I'm going to recruit type 2X fibers if I really need to. Right. Now, this is great, but in sport, this is not always what we want. If I'm a sprinter and I have to react to a gun going off, and the goal is to be as fast as possible when the gun goes off, which type of muscle fiber do I want to recruit?
Type 2A. I mean, well, X, or not, X. X,
Right? If I'm a sprinter and the gun goes off, whether I'm a swimmer or a runner or a cyclist, right? I need to move off the line, off the stand, off the blocks as fast as possible. That's the whole goal of a start. That's why we practice the start. Yes?
Yes.
So, powerful, short, hard, fast, out of the block. I need type 2X. But the principle says we do this, and then we do this, and then we do this. So, there's an exception, right? Typical, right? There's always an exception to the rule. So we have an exception to the rule because doing this involves a time delay, which might not help us out. So we can override it with enough training. We want to get these recruited first, not these. So under certain circumstances, I can ignore this rule and recruit type 2X straight away. So one of the things when we're training a start is we're training the brain to override this. We override it if we see the tiger, right? It's not very much help to me. The tiger's starting to run, and I have to start by walking and then jogging, and then finally I can sprint. Right? There are times when I need to be able to sprint without all the lead up. So, another one we have to pay attention to is the all or none law. The all or none says that when we reach threshold, all those motor units, all the fibers within that motor unit fire. So we mentioned that the other day, okay, when we looked at this picture. If this motor nerve is stimulated and reaches threshold and carries an action potential, then all the muscle fibers that it connects to are going to contract. I don't only contract one of them because the signal wasn't very strong. Either the signal is strong enough for contraction or it's not strong enough for contraction, period. Okay. And remember that the motor nerves are either type 1 or a type 2. So, all or none law, when threshold is reached, if I get a strong enough signal and my action potential is strong enough, then all the muscle fibers in that unit are going to contract. So that means that complicates the picture for the brain. Okay? Because now I have to decide not only which motor nerve am I sending the signal down, because which type of fiber do I want to recruit. But I have to make sure that the signal is strong enough that the fibers contract. Type 1s have a lower threshold. They're a little bit smaller. The threshold is lower. They're much easier to activate. Type 2s, the motor nerve is larger and there's more muscle fibers attached to it. So it needs a stronger stimulus to activate a type 2. If I'm looking at a muscle and I want it to react as fast as possible to a gun going off, then I want to recruit as many type 2X fibers as possible within that muscle. So now I have to send the signal down more than one motor nerve, and I've got to make sure the signal is strong enough to make all those muscle fibers contract. So it's quite a complicated picture once we start looking at what it is the brain is trying to juggle to make sure that we see movement. Another difference with type 2 fibers is that they have more potential for hypertrophy. So when we were looking at how do we grow in size, we said that hypertrophy was the predominant way that muscles grow after birth. So a type 2 fiber has the potential to be larger than a type 1 fiber. Well, you know, that really makes sense. If I jog a lot or I ride my bike a lot, do I get great big bulging muscles? No. Because if I jog or I ride my bike, I use type 1 fibers. And type 1 fibers don't grow as big as type 2 fibers. If I sprint, if I jump, if I weight train, I'm using more type 2 fibers, and type 2 fibers are good at getting bigger. So, if I sprint, I jump, or I lift, I get bigger muscles. If I swim, I jog, or I ride my bike, I'm not using the muscles that get big. So I can't get big muscles by jogging. So it's another myth that we can dispel. Right? I don't want to exercise because I don't want to get big muscles. Well, exercising and big muscles don't go hand in hand. Type 2s recover faster than type 1s. Also very useful when we look at the job they do. Right? A type 2 fiber is responsible for short, sharp pieces of work. It's going to use energy system 1, ATP-PC. They're going to use energy system 2, glycolysis. Very short amount of time we're looking at. Okay. So if I turn them off, if I'm not using it, so I jump, or I do a vault, or I do a beam routine, or I have a play on basketball or the football field, then once the play's over, they get some rest to try to recover for the next play. If they didn't recover very quickly, the next play wouldn't be very good, because I'd be out of energy already. Uh-oh. All right? So, type 2 fibers need to, this is all stuff, if you get the big picture, you don't have to learn all this tiny detail. If I'm going to use type 2 fibers, I'm going to stop, start, stop, start, stop, start. Right? The activity that I'm doing will be short. And probably I need to be able to repeat the activity quite quickly. Right? The rest period is not very long sometimes. So I need the type 2 fiber to recover quickly, and that's what we see. Type 1 fibers take a little bit longer. Type 1 fibers can keep going for a long time, but once they're fatigued, it takes them a while to come back. Right? If I run a marathon on Saturday, then if I'm daft enough to try and run another one on Sunday, chances are my time won't be as good on Sunday as it was on Saturday, because they won't have recovered by then. So that's just a picture, try to help you with that idea. All right, my order of recruitment. Typically, under normal circumstances, we are going to recruit type 1s, then type 2Xs, then type 2As, and lastly type 2X. Okay. Type 1s don't fatigue very quickly, so it makes sense we would want to recruit those first, because they're going to maintain contraction for longer. Then I add in type 2As, and if I have to, I can add in type 2X, but they're going to fatigue very quickly. So I don't want to put those into play unless I have to, because they don't last too long. Question? Got it? Piece of cake, right? So, adaptations, that's what we're interested in. We are teachers of movement, so we want to see the person be able to move better, right? We want to train the system so they're more efficient. We want to see positive adaptation, otherwise why do we train? Why do we practice? The only point is to see improved performance, and better efficiency in the systems leads to improved performance. So, if I'm doing strength or power work, then what we see occur within the nervous system, within the motor nerves that supply those muscle fibers, is that we see an increased contractile response. So the muscles increase the contraction based on the amount of motor unit recruitment and the rate of coding. Okay? How quickly do I recruit them, and what order do I recruit them in? Vary the amount of impulse generation. So if I'm sending the impulse very quickly, if I'm doing power work, I want as much power as possible in any sport. If I'm a jumper, I want to be able to jump higher. If I'm a thrower, I want to be able to throw further. If I'm a lifter, I want to be able to lift more weight. So I want more strength, more power if I'm using that kind of muscle fiber and doing that kind of action. Right? If I want to kick the ball, I want to kick it harder and further. So I need as much type 2 fiber contracted at one time as possible. So Remember our cross section with the grey and the white and the black. A muscle is not made up of a muscle cell. A muscle is made up of lots of muscle cells. So if I cross-section through your quadricep, okay, within your quad, you are going to have some type 1 fibers, and you're going to have type 2 fibers. Yes? Makes sense? Visually, that makes sense. Okay. So, if I am a sprinter, I don't really need my type 1 fibers turned on. They don't help me very much. I want to turn my type 2 fibers on. So when I'm a beginner, or I'm out of practice, or I've taken some time off, or I've been injured, then maybe I turn on that many type 2 fibers when I try to sprint. Okay. So I'm fast, but I'm not really fast. Okay. When I train, it will be, wouldn't I be faster if I turned on some more of those at the same time? Right? So, one of the things that happens, one of the adaptations we see is more efficient recruitment pattern. I learn to turn on more of these fibers at the same time. And so when we look at a strength training program, if you take someone who has not been training and you put them on a strength training program, you will see very, very, very rapid increases in their strength over the first few weeks. Anybody seen that? Anybody remember back to when they didn't train? Or anybody tried training someone new or helping a friend? Okay. When you start a program, you get very, very quick improvements. If that person is consistent and they do their program 2 or 3 times a week, after a week even, if you retested their strength, they will be stronger at the end of week 1. They're much stronger by the end of week 3 and week 4 than they were at the beginning. In 3 weeks, did this person go from this size to this size? Did they get massively bigger muscles in 3 weeks? No. No. Right? And yet, we see dramatic increases in strength. Because what changes when you start training initially is not the size of the muscle, it's the recruitment pattern. It's a neural adaptation that you see initially when you do a strength program. Right? Over the first few weeks, all those increases in strength aren't increases in the muscle fiber, it's increases in the systems communicating together and the brain learning how many muscle fibers it can turn on at one time. That's pretty cool. It's cool, right? That's really cool. I get stronger, and it's not because of an adaptation in my muscle tissue, it's because of an adaptation in my nervous system. That's pretty cool. And then, if I keep the program going, right, if I keep training, then I start to see adaptation in the muscle fiber, and the muscles get bigger. Right? But I have to keep it up for quite a while to see adaptation in the muscle tissue. Because putting on more protein takes time. Good nutrition, lots of sleep, lots of training. Right? It doesn't happen in 3 weeks. Putting on muscle size takes time. Gaining strength doesn't take time. Because the adaptation to the training program is in 2 different systems. Very cool. You should be kind of cool. on Monday.
Oh,
So,
I should've went in.
yeah. So, let me just have a look here. I'm going to finish the strength and power, and then we'll do the endurance on Friday before we review. All right? So, not very much muscle hypertrophy, lots of increases in strength. We synchronize firing our type 2 fibers. Right? That's the adaptation. So, more type 2 fibers means more force production, and we also start to send the signal a little quicker. So we see the rate of the force production, the peak force generation earlier. So that's great, it's a super adaptation, but remember these fatigue quickly. Alright, so be thinking, if this is the adaptation to strength power work in the nervous system, what would be a really useful adaptation when I'm looking at aerobic work? Okay. So we will look at the last two slides. Yes, sir.
Do we have a standard difference?
What's the question?